Hello, welcome, and I'd like to spend a few minutes with you talking about some of the happiest years in the life of Ellen G. White. She would probably say those years were the years before she left the farm. It was during those years that she picked up a lot of traits, or her personality began to take form. On one day, she walked out of the house with all of her brothers and sisters, and all of them were headed towards the forest. But Ellen dashed across the barnyard and went into the barn and located a bin where there were kernels of corn, and she stuffed them into her bag and then ran to catch up with her brothers and sisters who were going into the forest. It's in the forest that she will begin to develop certain personality traits. One of them was her love for words. She would always love words during the whole of her lifetime. And it's in the forest that she began to pick up that for the English vocabulary. Probably one of the first words that she learned in those years was the word hickory. Now, hickory was part of the English language and had become so several generations before the arrival of Helen. Now, in the slide here, you can see the hickory nut, the leaves of the hickory tree, also the fruit of the hickory tree, and a big hickory tree trunk. And also, I have the face of a book called Old Hickory, which really refers to the president of the United States in the 1820s, late 1820s. And Ellen probably began to pick that up in her home as her father came from town and began to talk of either the election or once he had become president. So for her, the word hickory, like many other words, hickory came from the Indian language. It had not been part of the English language up until the colonists arrived in North America. And like hickory, there were dozens of other words like tomahawk, moccasin. You could go through the dictionary and find many words that became part of New England English. And she developed that taste for words and writing, as you know, throughout her life. Another important event that I think took place here in the forest was a business transaction she conducted while in the forest on this particular day. As I said, she gathered corn kernels and took them with her into the forest and began looking for a hickory tree where a squirrel might hide hickory nuts. Now, she finally found one, climbed into a position where she could get to the nuts, and eventually she was able to replace all of the hickory, replace the corn for the hickory nuts which the squirrel had gathered. Now, corn, or Indian corn as it is commonly called, became a staple of the American diet. It had been brought to New England probably by Indian merchants. Corn had been harvested in the Valley of Mexico since many centuries prior to the arrival of the English. and corn, squash, tomatoes, all of these vegetables were being produced in New England when the colonists came and when Ellen and Elizabeth arrived on the farm. Harvesting corn became an annual feast, and it became part of the community. So Ellen knew that it took hard work to gather hickory nuts as it did to produce the corn. So she came into this business transaction where she recognized the value of work, the value of being honest, the value of not stealing, of dealing in a correct fashion with those around you, including the squirrels. Now, a third element of the growth of Ellen that took place here on the farm was the introduction to the world of ideas. Ideas would play an important part in her life during those years, not only on the farm, but during the years of formation before, when she went to school and before she got married. And I think one of the central ideas of the nation in those early years when Ellen was growing up was this idea that all men are created equal, which had been included in the Constitution of the United States. And although I think the founding fathers did not fully believe in the idea, because many of them were slaveholders, and they certainly did not consider women as part of that equation because they were not allowed or they were not given the right to vote. People of color generally were not part of this idea that all men are created equal. At least the first presidents of the nation and the Supreme Court justices of the early Supreme Court were by and large slaveholders. But the idea seeped out into the culture, and probably the place where you can see the idea flower most is in the Methodist community. And I say that because the Methodists had all of their pastors kicked out of the Republic as soon as the Republic declared itself independent. And so they were left with no ministers. There were only a handful of them. They went back to England. And what happened to the Methodist Church is that it became a church led basically by lay people. Women began to preach in the church. African Americans began to preach in the church. And they were called by the larger denominations of the time, the Congregationalists, the Episcopalians, they were called the Shouting Methodists because they had so much emotional display during their services. Here's a picture of a Methodist camp meeting where the ladies and the men are being very emotional in their interactions, and the people from the larger churches looked down on this. They were scandalized by this behavior. However, in the Methodist Church, shouting and jumping up and down and having visions was normal. And this is where Ellen White started her life in the community of Shouting Methodists. And so these ideas about the equality of man became part of her thinking in the farm and later when she moves to Portland in her teenage years in Portland. So I think these three things at least, I'm sure there are many, many others, became important in shaping Ellen's life in those early years whilst living in the farm, developing a vocabulary, interacting business deals, and the development of ideas and how they shape uh, the world in which she lived in. I hope this has helped get a more clear picture of who she was and the important things that happened in her life during those years where she was barely walking in the forest and living in the farmhouse. Thank you.